6:24 coming up towards 6:25 in Trinidad and Tobago. Good to have you with us on this Thursday. Well, there have been a number of responses to government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. They've made it clear that all actions are in the best interest of the country. But the leader of the Movement for Social Justice, David Abdulah, has questioned the wisdom and the value of those roadblocks as just one example of a different perspective. He joins us now via Zoom. David, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Your issue about the roadblocks being more of a nuisance elicited an immediate response from Commissioner of Police Gary Griffith, which is not surprising. But if you would contextualize it once again, because on the outset it would appear to be a sensible thing to do to ensure people not just going about the place putting themselves and the wider community at risk of community spread for COVID-19.
Yes, good morning, Fazil. Good morning to all the viewers and listeners on TV6. Thanks for having me on your program. Yes, I was making about 3 points in the statement issued 2 days ago, which actually appeared as a letter to the editor in full in yesterday's Express. And the 3 points I made: first of all, we support the government's exhortation, the call for people to stay at home, because it is much better for us to voluntarily comply with stay at home and therefore try and prevent any spread of the coronavirus than to be forced into such a situation by a state of emergency. So we support completely the stay-at-home call. Secondly, we said, though, that the police do not have the power under the public health regulations, which have been amended to deal with the virus. They don't have the power to actually tell people to go home or to, that you can't be out and about. And the Prime Minister made it very clear that the call for people to stay at home is a voluntary call. He's appealing to people's good sense, and we support that approach. But the various statements by the police were that these roadblocks were to send people home, but legally they can't send people home. So we were making that point. And thirdly, we were saying that the roadblocks actually in many cases have frustrated people who are supposed to be going to work, essential workers who are being caught in traffic jams for many hours and so on, and or people who are actually doing work. So they may be driving a truck, a delivery truck to deliver food or to go to the port to get goods to Tobago, or a TNTech or WASA vehicle and so on. And they're caught up in the traffic, and therefore they can't do the work that they are supposed to be doing, and therefore efficiency and productivity has been reduced for those workers. So we're saying that maybe we need to have another approach to trying to get people to voluntarily stay at home rather than have the police engage in the roadblock activity. Now, interestingly, the commissioner made one statement saying that the roadblocks are a powerful tool to get people to stay at home. Yesterday, the Minister of National Security had a different narrative, and he said that on Friday, the roadblocks were not designed primarily to have people stay at home, but rather were intelligence-driven, etc., etc. And so there seem to be different narratives coming out of the government and the police on this particular question. But we support completely the call for people to stay at home, and people ought not to have to be policed to do so. And the roadblocks, we're saying the same, find a more creative way of trying to get people to comply rather than roadblocks.
Which is why it's so important from a media point of view to have Stuart Young attend every media conference that he can, because he certainly provides us with a lot of contradictions and information in that regard. But just in relation to the roadblocks, what would have been a viable alternative? Is there any other option? Really, can you do anything else to urge people to stay at home or force people to stay at home for their own good?
Well, it's problematic. I mean, what the police have to make sure is that all non-essential activity, in other words, congregating in groups of more than 5, going to the beach, river lines, bars, restaurants, businesses are not supposed to be open. They have to make sure that all of that is not happening. And that will obviously minimize, the possibility of spread. Now, the other thing I think we have to address from a policy point of view is how do we manage the numbers of people who have been gathering, going about legitimate business, which is legally provided for in outside banks, outside supermarkets, outside Ministry of Social Development and so on, where you see these long lines. I think that is where some of the problems of potential community spread tends to come in. So how we manage that in terms of timelines, perhaps it might be that certain people can be going into these places of business on certain days of the week and others on other days of the week. We may have to find other creative ways of managing the possibility of people doing legitimate business, but actually congregating in numbers which create a problem.
You also commented as leader of the MSJ on the government's recovery team, as was announced by the Prime Minister just about a week ago, and defining it as a missed opportunity. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. Just to set the record right, or for those who may not be aware, the 1st of March at a press conference that we had, I called for a national emergency economic fund and plan, and repeated that again on the 8th of March and the 15th of March and elaborated on some details. And I said that it ought to be tripartite or multipartite. We had to have a participatory process and so on to deal with the economic issues that and social issues that were bound to arise, and I'm saying this on the 1st of March, from the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's an issue that we were very alert to and alive to from the very beginning. Our concerns after the announcement by the Prime Minister, and we needed to have such a committee, but we were concerned, and I'm not challenging the bona fides of any individual. I think every individual on that team has established his or her credentials. But the issue really was one of balance, because we quite apart from issues of gender and youth, which are valid concerns and so on, I think that if you overweight the committee with persons from the private sector and the large private sector, you leave out, for example, representatives of small and micro enterprises, which are the first ones who are going to feel the pinch from the shutdown because they don't have the cash flow to sustain their businesses for any length of time. And if you don't have anyone who is actively working with and understands the problem of people who are desperately poor, and the media have been reporting on various individual stories of families and people in different communities who are really now struggling and are going to find themselves in great difficulty at the end of April, in spite of the government's best intentions and efforts to provide salary relief grants and other social security support. There are tens of thousands of people who are struggling literally to survive at this point in time. And we needed to have persons who understand that social dynamic and who are connected with that social dynamic to be on such a committee, because if you're talking about recovery, it's not just business recovery you need to address. It is recovery of people's lives, because it is people who ultimately are going to drive the process of recovery, not just the business leaders, but also the people who have to work and the people who have to consume, which are the ordinary men and women of this country. And what is also critical and even more important than that point about balance is that this crisis really is an opportunity. There's a much cliched saying that the Chinese character for crisis is the same as that of opportunity. But this is now an opportunity to reshape, refashion, reconstruct, transform the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, the political relations, the social relations of people taking responsibility and so on. And so we needed to have not just technical inputs to recovery, but what I would call a political vision of what kind of society do we wish to have coming out of this, and which really, if you want, going back to our ideas of what is the Second Republic, what kind of society do we want in Trinidad and Tobago? And this is an opportunity for us to try to make a real start at fashioning that society.
But isn't it correct to say, David Abdulah, that no combination would satisfy everyone? And indeed, there's a Labour component, Christopher Henry representing JTUM, Michael Anisette representing NATOC, and yes, there's a strongly private sector presence and business and banking and so on, Rundle Fields of the Single Fathers Association. No combination would have satisfied everyone.
You're absolutely correct. Nobody can ever be satisfied in this society called Trinidad and Tobago. But the key is really to try to get the balance as right as possible. And yes, there'll be people who complain, but it is to try to get the balance as right as possible and to get the process as right as possible. And there are persons on the committee, I have no doubt, who will see the interests of those who are powerless and voiceless. But again, it comes back to now, what is the balance? Will their voice be overridden by more powerful, more influential voices, which you and I have talked about many times in our programs about the status quo, those who want to protect the status quo. In other words, people have been talking about the different types of organizing firms using the technology. So people would use apps to order goods and services and so on rather than have going into brick and mortar stores. Now that therefore has implications for people who work in brick and mortar stores. And so there's a whole range of issues that we have to discuss. To shape the kind of society. Are we going to have more workers who are on short-term contracts or temporary or casual workers? Who are the ones who are being most badly affected in an adverse way from this pandemic? Not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but globally. The so-called new precariat, those who are working in precarious work, who have no security and so on. But many of whom we also realize are essential to our survival. So, we need that conversation. And I'm not sure that the committee is constituted in such a way to have that kind of inclusive discussion about what kind of society Trinidad and Tobago. I think that is the most critical thing. We also have to ensure that whatever is arrived at is supported, bought into by as many people in the country as possible. Because if we don't have support, buy-in for the plans going forward, you're going to get a certain amount of resistance and pushback, because any process of change, we know that change is difficult. And all those who are involved in change management will say that it's not so much the decisions or proposals about what changes have to be made. It is to ensure that everybody who has to be involved in the change or who change affects have to be aware of what these changes are and are part of it and agree to it. Otherwise, the change management is just not going to happen.
We'll have to take a break. It's coming up to 6:36 in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a few minutes left in our discussion with David Abdulah, the leader of the MSJ, expressing some skepticism on a couple of issues related to governance in this time of COVID-19. We'll be back right after this. .39 in Trinidad and Tobago. Let me correct myself right away. That thing I was talking about, the best ever football team, is not a Trinidad and Tobago team. It's the best ever Caribbean team that was done by Sportsmax, which is why they had Dwight York, Russell Latapy, who they described as the greatest Caribbean footballer of all time, Stern John, the striker, and Shaka Hislop, 4 Trinis in the squad of 11. If we have time later on, I'll mention. I don't want to take up more time from David Abdulah, who's still with us, the leader of the Movement for Social Justice. Just on that point of the team, the recovery team, given your own involvement, David Abdulah, in the Economic Development Advisory Board, which was essentially stillborn, again, because of the failure to implement those recommendations, isn't all of this discussion about a recovery team just philosophical?
Well, I certainly hope it isn't, because if we don't have a very good roadmap to recovery, then our situation is going to be quite horrendous in this country in terms of the lives of ordinary people. So I certainly hope it's not just an academic exercise. There is one difference between the EDAB, which I was on, and this particular recovery team, and that is the Prime Minister is chairing the recovery team. And in the case of the EDAB, we reported to the Prime Minister and sent recommendations or memorandum to him. So one hopes that his chairing is an indication that he's an active participant in the committee, and therefore implementation will take place, because you can't get any higher than the Prime Minister in terms of government implementation. There are 3 former members of the EDAB on this committee: Professor Theodore, Miss Alison Lewis, and Mr. Selvan Hazel from Tobago. So there may be some relationship between some of the work that we did, which was not implemented, and this. I should say, though, that every time we start a process and we don't implement, then we are behind the curve in terms of economic diversification, the issue of agriculture, which people are now speaking about. So perhaps the necessity of invention is the need to create, and a crisis therefore may force us into doing what we have to do. Similarly to the Second World War, where Trinidad and Tobago became very significantly sufficient in food because we couldn't get food supplies because of the war. And we created things like war bonds that had to finance development and so on. So one is hoping that this crisis forces us to do certain things that the luxury of high oil and gas prices caused us never to take seriously.
I'll just get back to the agriculture situation in a moment, but on the point that you made, that you're hopeful that because the Prime Minister is chairman of the recovery team, that it should result in some implementation. But you're a politician yourself, David Abdulah. We're in an election year. Surely the evidence suggests that political imperatives will trump everything.
Well, this crisis is clearly going to be a test of leadership of everyone in the country, the political leaders included. And therefore, we will judge as a country the leadership of Dr. Rowley, both with respect to managing the health aspect, but also with respect to managing the economic recovery. And most importantly, ensuring that the lives of ordinary people who are suffering without a job, without an income, struggling to put food on the table, and small businesses that are seeing their businesses going bankrupt before their very eyes. We hope that the leadership of the government addresses those problems, and we will judge whether we did or not. We'll also judge the leadership of Mrs. Prasad's predecessor, who has been so negative all from day one, and therefore has been doing things that have not been helpful in this whole process. And the leadership of myself too, in terms of offering ideas from very early on about how we could get out of the situation as best as possible. So everybody's leadership is going to be on test, and therefore it ought not to be about party politicking, but really about who has been able to offer vision and ideas. And in the case of the government, because they're the ones in charge and have control of decision making, are they able and have they actually done things to make people's lives better? And the elections will ultimately determine what people's views of that are. Let's hope that the overriding culture of race and other things and money are minimized in that process.
Just on the point again of agriculture, the issue of food security, the issue related to all those elements concerning the food import bill and so on. Based on what I'm seeing from the 22 members, none of them identify as involved directly in agriculture. Maybe they have the odd kitchen garden or something in the backyard and they plant some bodhi or whatever. Of course, the Prime Minister would have been an agriculture minister for a brief period as well. But there's no overt and obvious expertise in agriculture in this team.
Yes, and that was one of the critiques that we made as well in terms of the balance of the team. And certainly agriculture is vital. In fact, you have one person who is the head of a group of companies that produces fast food and sells fast food in the country. So that, and while he may claim that they use local chickens and so on for his business, the fact of the matter is that fast food is not necessarily what we want to encourage for growing local and eating healthy. So you're right about that. And well, Trinidad and Tobago cannot be completely self-sufficient in food given our land size. We have to look at it from a CARICOM perspective. And we certainly hope that this is an opportunity now for us finally to have a Caribbean food plan, which has been talked about from the days of Dr. Williams. And there was in fact a food and agricultural company set up here in Trinidad and Tobago, funded out of our petrodollars in the 70s and so on, which never succeeded then. In Guyana, the former president, Baguio Jad, also proposed the issue of a Caribbean food initiative that never got off the ground. So we need to have a Caribbean food plan so that we can, in the region, be self-sufficient in food. That is absolutely essential.
David Abdulah, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us this morning. So many issues on the table. We haven't even touched on the 50th anniversary of the revolution of 1970 and the Black Power movement and on all the different NJAC and all the different things, because again, it's limitations of time, but also this is a country that is really not interested in analyzing its own history properly for succeeding generations. But that is a bigger discussion. 6:46 in Trinidad and Tobago. We'll be back right after this.